You're watching The Experience, Comic Culture and Sales, streaming live daily to Facebook, YouTube, Twitch, and Twitter.
So, you guys know how I don't like movies. Truth is, I love movies, and I want movies to be better. That's why I don't like movies. Or rather, I don't like the garbage that we pass off as superhero movies all that often. So last night I'm watching the Oscars, and there was a lot of talk about representation in film. A ton of talk about it. There were conversations about how Everything Everywhere All at Once was highlighting Asian representation, and how Black Panther Wakanda Forever was representing people of color and people from Africa, and how the costuming of that movie was very traditional yet very modern, and all of this stuff about that movie, and how The Whale represented people who were obese and people who were queer, and Women Talking represented oppressed women. And there were just so many examples on the Oscars last night of talking about representation of film, in film, and representing marginalized groups by and large. Comics have paved the way for representation in print and in making sure that no one was excluded. Everyone could see themselves in a comic book. Even if, interestingly enough about that, is that only recently has the work that's been created to show representation actually been created by people from those groups. Most of the time, they've been created by people from a different marginalized group. You think about how many of these creators were Jewish. That's a marginalized group creating these characters that were supposed to represent every American. So, one of my favorite companies has had this catchphrase for years, which is that comics are for everyone. And my friend Seth the Moose has a favorite saying when he talks about comics, is that same team. We're on the same team. If comics are really for everyone, what responsibility do comics have as it relates to representation? Right? Do they have a responsibility to represent people? And do they have a responsibility to represent everyone? And where does that land, right? Is it just on the page, or is it behind the pencil? This is Hot Takes. What's up, the internet? I am producer Kyle. Welcome into my show, Hot Takes, here on The Experience. Before we dive back into our topic of representation in comics, I want to take a minute and thank you guys for continuing to support us here on The Experience. We crossed a big benchmark for us this past weekend. We're getting our 1,500th subscriber. Now, I know what you're saying. There are other channels that are bigger. There are other channels that have more subscribers, but we are the only channel that I feel like is a community. So I want to thank you guys for your support and for building this community. It means the world to me. It means I don't have to go work in a factory and that I get to work in comic books, which makes me incredibly happy. If you're a little late to the program, we've only been live a couple of minutes. What up, Brad? Welcome in. If you're new to the program or you're just coming in, during the cold open, we talked a little bit. I read a thing I wrote basically, about the Oscars and all the talk last night on the Oscars about representation. And it got me thinking about comic books. And I'm watching the Oscars and I'm thinking about the X-Men because Well, Jay will tell you, as will pretty much anyone who knows me, I'm basically always thinking about the X-Men. Uh, I'm never really not thinking about the X-Men, in that the X-Men has something for everyone. Or the Turtles, you're right, but the Turtles are a very different fascination for me. But the Turtles are true of a very different way, and we'll get to the Turtles in a minute. But I'm almost always thinking about the X-Men because the X-Men really does feature something for everyone. I, as a fan of the X-Men, really identified with two of them, the Blob and the Beast. Why? Well, because I look like this and I'm this size. What's up, John? Welcome in. So, but the X-Men has representation for everyone. Oh, Brad, you got to wake up pretty early in the morning to out turtles me, my friend, but we'll try. The thing about the X-Men is that it has a little something for everyone, right? There's an X-Man character that is your favorite. Or conversely, everyone hates Cyclops, which is also fair. The thing about the X-Men, right, is that it has this sort of broad spectrum of what the powers and the characters are, what they represent, and who they represent. Right? You had your first openly gay character was Iceman from the X-Men. Your first openly hairy character was the Beast from the X-Men. Your first openly obese character was the Blob from the X-Men. You know, you can see why I like the X-Men, right? Hairy and obese. It works for me. So I'm watching the Oscars and they're talking about all of these movies. And they mention in Wakanda Forever comes up, the Black Panther Wakanda Forever. And they start talking about how much the representation of the African traditional garb went into the costuming and how the costumer used modern technology to make this old style. And I thought that was really cool. And I got to thinking about, if you're looking at this movie and you're seeing what it represents, two very distinct cultures, the African culture and a Hispanic culture, a Latinx culture, what other things could we be representing in movies from comic books? And what responsibility do we have? And then it got me thinking about making comic books. And like I said, what responsibility do comic books have to representation, both on the page and behind the pencil? There's this great book out there called Disguised as Clark Kent, written by Danny Fingeroth. If you don't know who Danny Fingeroth is, let me just tell you a little bit. Danny is the co-creator of Darkhawk and was an editor at Marvel for a long time. He's now the official biographer of Stan Lee. No one knows more about Stan Lee than Danny Fingeroth. But Danny had earlier written a book called Disguised as Clark Kent, which examines this idea that comic books are built on the backs of people of the Jewish faith, or people who are ethnically Jewish. Stan Lee, Jack Kirby, Joe Simon, Joe Siegel. People who are ethnically Jewish. At the time when they were creating these books, a very marginalized group and still a largely marginalized and mistreated group. If comic books are created by people who are underrepresented, what can comic books do better, and how can they be better? And then it got me asking this other question, which is, are we as people in the comic book industry responsible for having the type of people we're trying to represent on the page creating the characters? There's another great example, G. Willow Wilson, who you'll see is one of the greatest writers going right now, who is the creator of Kamala Khan, Ms. Marvel. And as that character has grown and become more mainstream and more popular, so have creators like G. Willow Wilson. When we talk about representation, it's a hard topic to talk about because not everybody feels represented in comics, even though they are. Or not every, or at the same time, comic creators just want to be known as comic creators, not as Black comic creators or gay comic creators or female comic creators or any other word in front of comic creators. They just want to be comic creators. So does it matter who makes the character as long as the character's right? If you have thoughts on this, feel free to call in. For those of you who are new, this is a call-in show. You can be on the air with me. All you have to do is hop on your phone and call 567-318-6507. 567-318-6507. And you can be on the air with me to talk about this topic. Here on The Experience, we have a really good mix of people, male and female, people who are on the LGBTQIA spectrum, people, I say spectrum, but people who are LGBTQIA, people who are from all different ethnic backgrounds, religious backgrounds, socioeconomic backgrounds. And over our existence, we've had things that we don't currently have represented. We had Black Comics Universe, which still exists and is out there. You can find it. It's a great website and Facebook group. We've done Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Months with Amy Chu and Ming Chen. We've tried really hard to represent everybody in comics. We did Pride Month with Prism Comics. We've tried really hard to represent everyone in comics because to me, it's important to give a voice to everyone in comics. And I like John's statement over here. John says, it doesn't matter to me as long as I get the characters right. Fair. But there are people out there who are making comics whose characters you've never heard of, right? Who are underrepresented and underserved parts of our community. And so it's always been important to me as the executive producer of The Experience to try to amplify those messages. Before G. Willow Wilson created Ms. Marvel, there weren't a lot of Muslim characters. It doesn't matter who creates the character. It's a courtesy when the artist shows where they got the idea from. I like that idea too. But if we're going to make a big deal about movies representing people, shouldn't we make a big deal about comic books doing the same? And shouldn't we make a big deal about the people who are making sure that that happens? I will, there's some stories that I'm not going to tell right on this show tonight. I'm not going to dive into some of this stuff because it is a sensitive topic and they're not my stories to tell, but they're stories I hear from people who work in this industry, people who are creators, people who are in the business end and things like that. But one I will tell is not really a story, but it's a thought. One of the most recognizable women in this industry is a woman named Morgan Perry. Morgan is the direct sales representative at Skybound Entertainment. So she works directly with Robert Kirkman and Skybound to get Skybound books placed in retail stores. Before that, Morgan was at Boom Studios, and she's one of the most steady and guiding forces in the direct market that there is. Morgan is a big fan of comic books, and she represents the women in the industry incredibly well. And every time I see Morgan, I think that's the kind of person I want out there on the front lines representing young women in this business. Now, I think Morgan and I are probably the same age, which is slightly old now compared to where we were when we started and when we first met. But she has this youth and vigor that's really important in our business. And then I look at Miss Jen, who is a tentpole in this business. Miss Jen is a leader in the comic book business. And if you didn't see her on Talking Shop, you'll see her tomorrow, maybe on Minute to Skim It. She's always on the air. She's one of the founders of The Experience. she is a trailblazer in terms of there aren't that many women retailers. So now in a heavily male-dominated industry, you have two women who are blazing a new path and holding these jobs and standing next to the men in the industry, if not in front of them, in terms of innovation and leadership. I've been incredibly lucky to get to work with these people. So when I think about representation in comics, I wonder if there's a problem, if we really need to do better, or if we're doing good. And I don't always know the answer because I, as a cisgender white male, think we're proud. I don't know the answer because I don't live in those shoes. But when I look at characters that are being created, I don't see them all the time. So when we come back from our first break, we're going to take our first break right now. When we come back from our first break, I want to dig into some of these characters and some of these people and why they exist in the way they exist. And again, I encourage you, if you have thoughts on this, give me a call, 567-318-6507, and we'll dig in. And I want to hear what you have to think. I appreciate John and Brad for chiming in the comments. And anybody else who's got a thought, throw it in the comments or give me a call and we'll talk about it. Real quick before I go to break. Tomorrow here on The Experience, we have the Dan Wickline Show at 5 o'clock Eastern. I don't know exactly what Dan's going to be talking about, but he has some new segments and some fun stuff he's doing on that show that will help you as you get into more collecting and digging into some of the new hotness that's out on the market these days. After that, it'll be Jay, who's behind the scenes tonight, myself and Dan talking about books that are in stores this week, followed by Minute to Skim It. Minute to Skim It's a really unique concept, guys. Don't miss it. It's a really fun show that can really introduce you to a lot of great books that you'll want to pick up from your local comic shop. So the first 3 shows tomorrow are all informational. And then we get James from Mint Hunter Comics. James has great stuff, great product. He puts on a really good show, stuff you could take home. So make sure you set your dials, your YouTube notifications, your Facebook notifications. Click the bell, click remind me, whatever you got to do. Put an alarm in your phone to tune in here tomorrow starting at 5 o'clock Eastern, 2 p.m. Pacific on The Experience. We'll be right back after these words from Comic Shop Locator and everybody else here on The Experience.
You know how when you go to Comic-Con, after Comic-Con, you go to the hotel bar, and there's a whole bunch of people playing music and dancing, and you've got Pikachu and Lara Croft Tomb Raider doing the cha-cha slide just down from Deadpool and Batman and Wonder Woman? That's every Saturday night over on the Experience Twitch channel. Join Taji Beats for the EXP Dance Party, exclusively on Twitch, twitch.tv/the_EXP.
To be continued. 3 little words that hold the secret to the next great story. 3 words that will thrill you, confound you, give life to new possibilities. Every variation of To Be Continued is a promise. A promise of adventure. A promise of excitement. A promise of unseen wonders and unexplored worlds. A promise that every issue you read makes you a part of a never-ending journey. And behind every page, there will be an unopened door waiting for you. This story to be continued at your local comic book shop today. Visit comicshoplocator.com today.
Did you know that every Experience show, including some exclusive content, streams on Twitch? Check it out. Twitch.tv/the_EXP. Or just scan that QR code.
Welcome back in. This is Hot Takes. I am still producer Kyle. You're watching The Experience. Thank you for being here. We're talking about representation in comics tonight. And if you have a thought or opinion you want to share about this topic, go ahead and give me a call. 567-318-6507. 567-318-6507. You can be on the air here with me. We had on the air on Wednesday, on the Dan Wickline show, Jeff Trexler. Jeff is the interim director of the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund. If you don't know what the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund is, it's an organization that provides funding and support for comic book creators, publishers, retailers, and anyone else in the industry when they are in any way legally challenged about the work they create, sell, distribute, any of that. A big example of this is a book called Gender Queer, which is a wildly popular book that came out that is being challenged all over the country because of the LGBTQIA themes in the book. Comics have, for years, dealt with issues of sexuality. For many, many years. I remember the first time I saw Howard Chaykin's Black Kiss, which was a book that, in no uncertain terms, dealt with concepts of transgender roles in society and cross-dressing and things like this that in the 80s were wildly out of the norm in comic books. But you had Iceman, who was also openly gay. And you have all of these other characters who, for lack of a better term, were defined by their sexuality in the comic book world. And those books all got challenged. And CBLDF supported them. And that conversation that Jeff had also led me to this topic of representation. If comic books aren't a place to discuss the rapidly changing parts of society, then what place is? Because I don't know about you, but my parents aren't the kind who are going to sit me down and explain to me trans rights. My parents don't understand them. When I was a teenager, when they should have been having this conversation, they didn't understand them. There's a new generation of parents who do, but there are generations of kids who have had to learn about things that are outside of their comfort zone from comics. I didn't fully understand many topics until I learned about them from comics. And so when we talk about representation in comics, it's not just ethnic or religious representation, it's socioeconomic and human representation. When we first launched The Experience, we did an interview with Neil Adams. And, Neil Adams created a ton of great comics. And Neil Adams really, in a big way, stood in front of and stood up for comic creators who couldn't for themselves. Neil Adams is the reason that Siegel and Schuster didn't die broke and penniless. He fought DC so that they would get paid for Superman. Now, that might by no means fixed all the wrong DC had done to those guys. But Neil Adams stood up for them. He stood up for these creators who, because of their being a part of a marginalized group, weren't able to do it themselves. And Neil Adams created John Stewart, the Green Lantern. And he tells a story in this interview that he's having a conversation with a DC editor, and they want him to create a black Green Lantern. They want a character who's black. And Neil Adams was the only person who knew how to draw black characters at DC at the time, who knew how to get the facial features to look correct, who knew how to draw the hair, who knew how to get the shading correct, and at the same time be respectful for the African American experience. And he goes into his editor's office and they're talking about this character. And the editor says something to the effect of, why don't you call him Lincoln Washington? And Neil Adams goes, do you know any people who are named that way, really? Especially black people. You don't know anyone who's named that way. And so the editor goes, well, what are you going to call him? He goes, I don't know. I'll call him John Stewart. And it stuck. And then Neil makes a joke about how would he know that John Stewart would go on to become a late night comedian and this, that, and the other. But it was Neil Adams making sure that they were representing the reality of the people who John Stewart, the Green Lantern, was supposed to represent, that made that character so iconic. Neil Adams wasn't black. Neil Adams didn't know that experience, but Neil Adams recognized the importance of being true to what you were trying to represent. It's the same thing you guys were saying earlier. It doesn't matter who creates the story so long as they do the characters right. It doesn't matter who creates the character. It's a courtesy when the artist shows where they got the idea from. Here's the thing. In an altruistic world, in a Neil Adams world, I don't think it matters. Because Neil Adams is someone who, at the core of what he's doing, is doing it out of respect for the character and where the character is supposed to come from. But I don't know that in today's comic book world that exists as much. Now, there are certainly characters and creators who do, who are in that same world, who are trying their hardest to represent the truth of the character. Excuse me. I'm still not quite over the COVID and the sickness that I've had the last couple of weeks. Sorry. I think there are still creators who are out there trying to do that, but there are just as many creators who are just trying to meet their deadlines, who are just trying to get their stories out, who are just trying to get their books read. And as a result, I don't know that the same care is being paid. So I believe that you have to have the people making the books to represent the characters. I'll give you another example. There's a documentary that came out last year on HBO Max about Milestone Comics. And it talked about Reggie Hudlin. And it talked about Dennis Cowan. And it talked about Joseph Village. And all these guys who created the original Milestone characters. And I had a strong emotional response to that documentary. Because for the first time, those Milestone characters, when I discovered those Milestone characters, when I discovered the cartoon shows, it was the first time I saw characters who looked like my friends in my comics. Now, of course, I had seen John Stewart, Green Lantern. Of course, I had seen, some of the characters in Marvel Comics, but really, the first time I saw characters that looked like my friends. My friend Imani did a TED Talk where before a book called Brother Man came out, he wanted to be called Steve because all his friends were white and all his comic book characters were white, and he liked Steve Rogers. Then Brother Man came out. Then Milestone came out. And Imani finally saw himself in comics. You can't make those comics unless you've lived that life. I don't think you can. So I think it's important that on both sides of the page, right, on the page and in the background, we have representation, that we see the people making the comics that they're reflecting on the page, because they're the only ones who have lived that life. I'm not saying the only way you can have a black character on the page is to be a black writer. I'm not. Or a black artist. I'm not saying that. But if you're going to create a character, if you're going to really tell a story with a character, having a similar background or going through something similar to that character certainly influences it. We go back to Disguised as Clark Kent, Danny Fingeroth's book. And he talks about the things that Siegel and Schuster were seeing and why they created Superman the way they created him. And truth be told, the original Jewish folklore that is the background for Superman. They took stories that they had been raised on in the Yiddish tradition and applied it to the muscle builders and professional wrestlers and weightlifters and guys they were seeing in magazines to make this all-powerful golem, essentially, that became the first superhero, Superman. They were representing their struggle, but putting it onto someone who is stronger than they were to overcome their struggle. You look at the characters in Milestone, and that's the same thing that Reggie Hudlin and Dennis Cowan and those guys were doing. It's the same things that Christopher Priest has done in his career. It's the same thing. Yes, Captain America is a golem to fight Hitler. It's the same tradition. And so when you look at those stories, it becomes incredibly clear to me that when you're creating a character, when you're looking at a character, when you're trying to come up with a story to tell, your life is the only thing that can really influence that character. And then once you've established the ground rules, other people can take it and run with it, but it'll never be quite the same. There's this idea that comics shine a light on society and take that light and magnify whatever's underneath it to the 10th, 12th, 20th power. I just throw a number on there, but magnify the spotlight they're shining on society, whether it be a shortcoming or a triumph, or some other part of society where it's, this is my truth that I'm living. There's a cover of a Marvel comic that is a direct representation of this. And this cover started what I consider one of the darkest movements in comic book history, or spun out of one of the darkest moments in comic book history. It's Mockingbird #6, and it has Mockingbird on the cover and a t-shirt that says, "Ask me about my feminist agenda." This book spun out of a time when the internet was throwing such vitriol at female creators, female editors, that they were leaving the industry in droves. They were scared to tell their stories because of what would happen to them on Twitter. There's a very famous story that you can look up about people bashing female editors and creators because they went and bought milkshakes. Not because the stories they made were bad, because they went and bought milkshakes. And so what you've seen spring up out of this conversation, out of this moment, is a rise of strong female protagonists. A revitalization of characters like Moon Girl in Moon Girl and Devil Dinosaur, of characters like Black Widow, of characters like Patsy Walker, Hellcat, Jessica Jones, Shuri from Black Panther, Storm from the X-Men. You know, and you have characters like Supergirl and these characters at DC that are very much the same. And this strengthening of the female protagonist, and that comes out of these editors and these writers and these artists telling their truth through story. I don't know that we get this last phase of the Marvel Cinematic Universe if not for that story, if not for that time. You don't have a strong female Black Widow on screen if you don't have a strong female Black Widow in the comics. You don't have a strong Scarlet Witch, right? Leading the charge and trying to get what she wants in, Scarlet Vision and Scarlet Witch, or in WandaVision. You don't get America Chavez in Doctor Strange if not for the creation of America Chavez telling stories that represent Hispanic culture as Captain America, essentially. I think that representation is important. I think that as long as you do right by the characters, you get a pass. And there's nothing wrong with that. I think that allowing people to tell their truth through these characters strengthens the comic book industry. So my question back at the beginning of the show is, what responsibility do comic books have towards representation? What responsibility do comic books have towards representation on the page? And what responsibility do comic books have towards representation behind the pencil? And the answer that I keep coming to myself is that comic books are nothing but a responsibility towards representation. Now, if you don't tell good stories, it's not going to matter how representative you are, right? You have to first tell good stories, and then you have to use those stories to represent the reality of the world we live in. But it's my belief that some of the best ways to tell good stories is to let the people who you're trying to represent tell those stories. There's a rich history in the 70s and the 60s, 70s, 50s, 60s, 70s, even into the early 80s of underground comics. And what I mean by underground comics is that they're comics that are intentionally out of the mainstream. Not independent comics, which is something we'll talk about here in a minute, but underground comics, comics that are purposefully obfuscating their existence out of the mainstream. And those comics always tend to shine a brighter light on the parts of society that we don't look at. You look at books like Mouse or American Splendor or some of the animal funnies. And the guys who made these books were taking these stories that they saw on the news, they saw in their real life, they saw in the movements they were a part of, and assigning them to comic book characters in order to make light of the situation, but also to make make it easier to gain knowledge of the situation. I'm not someone who ever lived through the Holocaust, right? But Art Spiegelman's family did. And so Art Spiegelman, as a cartoonist, uses the medium at his disposal to tell his family story. And I don't think anyone else could tell that story the way he did or the way it needed to be told in any other form. I don't know. But I don't think he could. I don't think that comics are necessarily always a mechanism of change. The same way I don't always feel like music or movies or any kind of pop culture is necessarily always a mechanism for change. But I think it certainly can be. And so when we come back from our second break, which we're going to take right now, we're going to talk about mechanisms of change and how you can be a mechanism of change, in my opinion. Last call for phone calls, 567-318-6507, 567-318-6507. Jay put it up at the bottom, and we're going to take a quick break. And when we come back, we'll take any phone calls we might get, and we'll talk about being a mechanism for change when we come back. Go ahead and leave it up, Jay.
You just finished the last episode of your favorite news show, and you just have to talk about it. But all your friends are ghosting you because of that incident last week at the buffet. Oh, you know the one. What you did to that chowder. Ugh. Keeps me up at night. So what do? Join writer Dan Wickline as he breaks down all your favorite pop culture media. Whether it's a review of the latest nerdy TV show or a dive back into the history of your favorite comic characters, Dan's ready to discuss all the hottest topics live. Join the conversation as Dan live streams Tuesday through Thursday at 5 Eastern, 2 Pacific on Twitch, Twitter, YouTube, and Facebook. The Dan Wickline Show on The Experience, Comic Culture and Sales.
Go follow The Experience on TikTok at @the_EXP1 or scan the QR code on the screen. Our TikTok is like everywhere else we are, except you only have to deal with us for a minute. Seems like a win-win to me. Welcome back, everybody. This is Hot Takes. I'm producer Kyle. Last call for phone calls. If you want to talk about representation in comics, 567-318-6507, 567-318-6507. We'll have a conversation.
I said before the break we were going to talk about being a mechanism of change. And I also said we were going to talk about indie comics, and I think the two are connected. I spend a lot of time with independent comic book creators. They are, in my opinion, the lifeblood of the industry. There are a ton of wonderful, great creators who are working for big companies and small companies alike. But independent creators are the people who are out there doing it themselves. John Stout, I think comics can be an influence of change. They certainly get a lot of backlash from certain groups when they do something that promotes more inclusiveness, at least in the last few years. You're right, and I'm gonna mention that. There's a story that's going around that's very interesting about that. TJ James, that is, I think, part of the overall issue. Representation that is organic and or original and well-written, drawn will find an audience and champions. Yes. Representation that is forced or inorganic opens itself up to be panned, but tends to have its failure blamed on racism or sexism or any other hate that is not often a realistic look at the packaging. Absolutely not saying that hate doesn't exist, but it is too often used as a scapegoat for poor craftsmanship. And there's another thing it's a scapegoat for, and I'm gonna hit it in just a second. But independent creators, independent comics, they're the people out there telling stories that can't find a home at companies that are owned by giant corporations. Henri Compton, who was on the air earlier, who you may know, I know TJ knows him. Henri's a great example. Henri's out there telling the story of Isun Shin, who is a Korean military leader a long time ago. It's not a story you're going to see a movie about. It's not a story you're going to see a television show about necessarily, even though it's been mentioned in many. But Henri's also out there telling the story of Marx, which is his grandfather and his grandfather's experiences in the Second World War. Henri is telling true stories from his own existence in a way that only Henri can, in a way that's only going to be acceptable in independent comics. Most of the LGBTQIA stories, most of the stories about racism and ethnic warfare and classism and all of these things that we desire for representation of, are being told in independent comics better than they're being told by the big two or even the top 5 or top 10, because that's the only place you can truly be honest about it. Because there's no one there to tell you no. So I want to encourage you, we talk about being a mechanism of change. I want to encourage you, next time you're at a convention, next time you're in a comic shop, next time you come across a creator who doesn't look like you, who doesn't think like you, who isn't from the same place as you, pick up their books and read them. Pick up their books and support them. Even if you wind up not liking their books. The idea of supporting someone who's trying to tell a story that isn't like every other story is the only way we can support true inclusion in comic books. There are women creators who stand in Artist Alley just like there are men creators. There are gay creators and trans creators and everyone else in Artist Alley, just like there are, just like anyone else. There are creators of diverse ethnic and sociological backgrounds and racial backgrounds in Artist Alley. They exist. Don't be scared to walk up to them. There's one other thing you can do to be an instrument of change in the comic book world. And it's what TJ James has kind of mentioned here. There is a popular talking point on certain news channels. That DC is canceling a book with Jonathan Kent because, quote, it's too woke. They made Jonathan Kent gay and no one liked it, these pundits scream. But they don't look at what's actually happening in the industry. They don't look at what's actually happening at DC Comics. They don't look at the truth of the matter, which is that the book actually sold very well for DC Comics, in the top 5 for DC Comics on the weeks when it came out. They don't look that DC is restructuring their entire universe, that the book was canceled so that it could be brought back as a different title with the same character, grouped in with other characters in an effort to build a new, younger Justice League. They're not looking at the industry. So when you hear people spouting this hatred, when you hear people talking about what TJ James says, when they're blamed on things like racism, sexism, or other hate, look at the packaging. Look at what Marvel has announced. Look at what DC has announced. Look at what these other companies have announced is coming. Jonathan Kent isn't going away. Jonathan Kent isn't going to not be gay anymore. Jonathan Kent isn't too woke. Jonathan Kent is being repackaged to further that story in a much better way. I tell people all the time, it's like the soda pop example. In the old days, they didn't have pop tops on cans. Or more, they don't care about facts. That's been obvious for quite a while. You're right. But they're not looking deep enough, John. That's the thing. If you just look at what DC's announced, if you just look at what Marvel's announced, it's obvious what's happening. But they don't look. As an instrument of change, you look. In the old days, if you bought a can of Campbell's soup, you couldn't open it without a can opener. Now they have a pop top. The packaging changed. The product didn't. Always look to the next level. Be an instrument of change by ignoring what you hear and doing a little bit of research and looking a little deeper. I'll tell one last story and then we're going to get out of here. I was in a local comic shop the other day, and the proprietor of the local comic shop was talking about how they can't keep certain graphic novels in stock. And they were talking to one of the customers, and this customer said, you can't keep them in stock. They must not be publishing enough. And the local retailer didn't correct them. So I asked the retailer, I go, what books can't you keep in stock? I'm interested to know. And they started naming off books like Lore Olympus, Genderqueer, The New Kid. Books that are being challenged all over the country. Books that are being printed as fast as they can find paper for them because they're selling so well. Just because something looks one way doesn't mean it is. Just because it looks like there's representation in comics doesn't mean there is. We can do better. We have to do better. It's the way the industry grows. It's the way the industry survives tough times. By finding something new and championing it. So, like I said, and Jenna said this, Artist Alley is where the real fun and party is. Walk through an Artist Alley at the next convention you're at. Pick up a book from somebody you've never heard of. Somebody who looks different than you, sounds different than you, thinks different than you. And don't let people shout down perfectly good ideas in favor of their own narrative.
Always remember that comic books are way more complex than they seem. They're not just stories for kids. And read something that you wouldn't otherwise read. Thanks for watching. I want to thank John, Jenna, TJ James, Brad. I saw Kenneth Bird here. Nerdtastic News is our newest supporter. I want to thank you guys for being here. It means the world to me that you're here. Next week, we're talking about something different. Next week, we're talking about variant covers. A little bit lighter topic, but still important. We'll see everybody next week on Hot Takes. Thanks for being here.
Join the party. Head over to our link tree to find all the links for everywhere the experience is all the time.